Something was left outside. When the door of the ark closed, not everything that existed on earth was meant to survive. The waters came, the sky broke open, and somewhere out there, in the middle of that rising darkness, were the Nephilim, the largest, most powerful beings that had ever walked the ground. They were not inside the ark. They were not protected. And what happened to them during those 40 days and 40 nights has never been fully told. Before we reveal what happened to the Nephilim when the flood swallowed the world, share this video, leave a like, and subscribe. What you're about to hear changes everything. The rain started slowly. It was not an immediate wall of water that hit the earth all at once. It began as something steady, something that built pressure over hours. The sky had never done this before. There had been no rain in the way it now fell, not in this form, not with this weight. The ground, which had always absorbed moisture from below, now received it from above, and the earth did not know how to hold it. The Nephilim were spread across the land. They lived in different regions in different groups, and they were not a unified force. Some of them had built structures. Some of them moved in large numbers together. Some stayed in places that were naturally elevated, but none of them had any real warning that what was coming would not stop. In the first hours of the rain, it was not yet alarming to them. They were massive beings. They had lived through storms. They had seen rivers swell. The idea that water could threaten them, creatures of that size, that strength, was not something any of them had calculated. So in those first hours, they moved normally. Some of them kept doing exactly what they had always done, but the rain did not stop. By the time the water started pooling on the ground in unusual ways, collecting in low areas faster than it ever had, the Nephilim began to notice that something was different. The ground was not draining. The rivers started rising. Streams that had always been small began spreading outward. The noise of the rain above them was constant and growing louder. There were Nephilim near bodies of water, rivers, lakes, coastlines. These were the first to experience what was actually happening. The water near them began rising at a rate that had no explanation. The edges of rivers disappeared. The banks were gone. Then the surrounding ground disappeared underwater. It happened faster than anyone could track, because the rain was not just falling from the sky. Water was also pushing up from below. The ground itself was releasing water. Springs that had been sealed for a long time broke open. The earth cracked in places, and water came through those cracks. The Nephilim near low ground were forced to move, and they moved toward higher ground, which is what any large being would do when water rises. This was instinct. This was survival behavior. They moved away from the water toward hills, toward mountains, toward any elevation they could reach. And because of their size and strength, they moved faster than other creatures. They covered more ground. They climbed more easily, but the water followed. This is the part that became clear to them gradually. Then suddenly, the water was not going to stop at a certain level. It kept coming. Every time they reached a higher point and felt temporarily safe, the water continued rising beneath them. It climbed the sides of hills. It covered valleys. It reached the lower slopes of mountains. The Nephilim, who were in groups, started moving together toward the tallest elevations they knew. They had knowledge of the land. They had been on this earth for a long time, and they understood geography in ways that other creatures did not. So they made decisions based on what they knew. They identified the highest points they had ever seen or traveled to, and they moved toward those places with urgency. There was no panic in the way a smaller creature panics. Their size gave them a kind of physical confidence that stayed with them even as conditions worsened. They believed that somewhere above the waterline there was dry ground. That belief kept them moving. That belief kept them climbing. The ark was already sealed. It had been closed before the rain began. Whatever was inside that structure was separate from everything happening outside. The door had been shut and nothing outside could enter. The Nephilim had no connection to what was happening inside the ark. They had no access to it. Even if they had known exactly where it was, the ark was now floating. It had lifted from the ground as the water rose beneath it. It was no longer a fixed point. It moved with the water. The Nephilim kept climbing. On the second day, the rain was heavier. The sky was dark in a way that did not change. There was no clearing, no break in the clouds, no shift in light. The water on the ground was now deep enough to make movement harder, even for the Nephilim. In lower areas, the water was at a level that would have completely submerged smaller creatures. But the Nephilim were still above it, still moving, still pushing toward elevation. The dead were already beginning to appear in the water. Other creatures that had not reached high ground in time were now floating. Animals, smaller beings, things that had been living freely on the earth just 2 days before were now part of the rising water. The Nephilim moved through this and kept going. The noise of the rain was now something that pressed down on everything. It was not just the sound of water falling, it was the sound of an entire sky releasing everything it had. It was the sound of the deep below the ground releasing everything it had been holding. The world was coming apart at a level that had nothing to do with weather. Something structural was happening to the earth itself. There were Nephilim who reached the lower ranges of mountains on the second day. They climbed. They used the size of their bodies as an advantage, pulling themselves up terrain that would have stopped other creatures completely. They moved in silence because there was nothing to say. What they were experiencing had no reference point. There was no event in their memory or the memory of any being they had known that explained what was happening now. Some of them reached high ridges. From those ridges, they could see in every direction, and what they saw was water. Everywhere below them, in every valley, across every plain, over every hill that was shorter than where they stood, water. Still rising, still coming. On the third day, the groups of Nephilim that had been traveling together were beginning to separate, not because of conflict, because the terrain made it impossible to stay together. Mountain climbing at that scale, with water rising behind them and beneath them, forced them into different paths. Some went left along a ridge, some went right. Some found a path upward and took it without waiting. The group structure they had maintained broke apart under the pressure of survival. The water was now reaching the lower sections of the mountains they were climbing. It was filling the valleys between mountain ranges completely. Lakes that had existed at altitude were now just part of one continuous surface of water. The boundaries between bodies of water were gone. It was becoming one thing. The Nephilim, who were alone, those who had not been near any group when the rain started, had their own experience of this. They had moved alone from the beginning. They had made their own decisions about which direction to go. Some of them made good decisions early and were higher up by the third day. Some of them had moved in the wrong direction at first and had lost critical time. Their situation by the third day was worse. The rain continued. There was no sign from the sky that it would stop. No break in the clouds, no change in wind, no lightening of the darkness above. The water below continued its upward movement, steady and without pause, as if it had a destination it intended to reach. By the fourth day, the highest points that were reachable, the ridges, the upper slopes of mountains, the plateaus at elevation, were crowded with every living thing that had made it that far. Animals were there alongside the Nephilim. Creatures that would never have been near each other under normal conditions were now pressed together at altitude because that was the only dry ground remaining. There was no predator behavior happening. There was no hunting. Everything that was alive and on high ground was focused entirely on staying on high ground. The Nephilim, who had made it to these upper regions, were now watching the water continue to rise below them. They watched the elevation marks they had mentally noted. That ridge, that rock formation, that line of trees at a certain height, disappear underwater, one by one. Each disappearance told them the same thing. The water was still coming up. The question that formed, though it formed without words, formed purely as an awareness, was how high the water was going to go. They had assumed it would stop. They had assumed that the highest points of land would remain above the water. That assumption was now becoming uncertain. On the fifth day, the water reached the lower portions of where the Nephilim were standing, not over their heads, not yet, but around their feet, their legs. The ground they had been standing on was now wet, now covered, now shallow water. They moved higher, the mountain peaks, the very tops of things. Animals that could not go higher were beginning to drown at the edges of the high ground. The Nephilim watched this happen around them. The water kept taking everything below a certain line, and that line kept moving upward. The size of the Nephilim, which had kept them moving and climbing for days, was now both an advantage and a problem. They were tall enough that the water had to rise much higher to reach their heads than it would for anything else. But they were also too heavy to float effectively. They could not simply stay on the surface of the water the way some creatures could. Their mass worked against them in water. They could move through water, swim through it, but doing so for extended periods in rough conditions with no land beneath them was not sustainable. Some of the Nephilim began moving into the water intentionally, swimming, trying to find anything above the surface to hold on to. Mountain peaks that were still visible above the waterline were targets. They swam toward them. They grabbed onto rock. They held on with the strength that their bodies had, which was considerable. But the water kept rising. The peaks they held onto began to disappear beneath the surface. Not all at once, gradually. The rock they gripped went lower and lower relative to the water surface. They had to move their hands higher, then higher again. Then the rock was gone. By the seventh day, the highest natural points on the earth, the peaks of the tallest mountains, were approaching the water level. This is the point at which the situation for every Nephilim still alive became the same situation: open water, no land, no surface to stand on, no fixed point to hold. They were in the water, all of them. Whatever dry ground had remained was now gone or nearly gone. The Nephilim, who were still alive at this point, were staying above the surface through their own physical effort. They were large. They could keep themselves up, but there was nothing beneath them, and the water was cold, and the rain was still falling. The ark was somewhere on that water, floating, sealed, moving with currents that the flood itself created as water from the broken earth and the broken sky collided and pushed and circulated. Inside the ark, there was sound, animals, the structure groaning, rain on the outside, but inside there was no view of what was happening outside. No windows looking out onto the surface of the water, no way to see the Nephilim. Outside, on the surface of the flood, the situation for the Nephilim was one of exhaustion. Their bodies were powerful, but sustaining themselves in open water with no land, no food, no rest, in continuous rain, was a physical demand that could not be maintained indefinitely. Even the largest and strongest body has limits, and the Nephilim, for all their size, were still physical beings in a physical world. Their muscles worked, their lungs breathed, their bodies got cold. The cold was a significant factor. The water that covered the earth was not warm. It had come from the deep, from underground sources that had never been exposed to sun. It had come from the sky, where temperatures were lower. The mixture of these sources created water that was cold, and sustained exposure to cold water drains physical energy faster than almost anything else. The Nephilim were losing heat. Their bodies were working to generate warmth, and that effort consumed energy they did not have a way to replace. Some of them tried to group together again. When beings are in water in a group, they can share warmth and share the effort of staying afloat. The Nephilim, who could find each other in the open water, moved toward each other. But the water was vast. It was the entire surface of the earth. Finding another being in that expanse was not simple. Some of them found others. Many of them did not. The ones who stayed in groups lasted longer. Their combined physical mass and their shared effort gave them more time on the surface. They held on to each other in some cases. They occupied the same small area of water, moving together, trying to conserve energy. But there was no outcome available to them that involved survival. There was no land to swim to. There was nothing above the water. There was nothing to eat. There was no rest possible. The ones who were alone went under first, not because they gave up. Their bodies simply ran out of the energy required to keep them on the surface. When a body that size can no longer generate enough force to stay above water, it goes under. It is a physical process. It is not a choice. The body stops being able to do what it has been doing, and then it cannot do it anymore. Each Nephilim who went under did so separately, at a different point, in a different location on the surface of the flood. There was no single moment. It happened across days. The last ones, the strongest, the largest, the ones in groups, lasted the longest. But the water had now covered the earth completely. There was no end to it in any direction. There was nothing to hope for in terms of land appearing or water receding. The rain was still falling. On the 40th day, the rain stopped. But stopping the rain did not immediately change anything for the water level. The water was there. It covered everything. The rain stopping meant no new water was being added from the sky, but the water that was already there, covering every valley, every plain, every mountain, every peak, that water remained. By the time the rain stopped on the 40th day, the Nephilim were gone. Every one of them. The last of them had gone under before that point. The surface of the water was still. Rain no longer disturbed it. The sky above, for the first time in 40 days, was not actively falling. The water was just there, flat and enormous, covering everything that had existed on the earth before it. The ark moved on that surface, still sealed, still floating. The beings inside it were alive. Nothing outside the ark was alive on the surface of the water. The NEPHILIM, who had been spread across the entire earth, who had been the largest and most powerful beings walking the ground, who had moved and climbed and swum and fought the water for as long as their bodies could sustain it, were gone. The water stayed at its maximum level for a period after the rain stopped. It was not immediate that it began to recede. The earth needed time. The same forces that had opened up and released water from below needed to shift. The sky needed to change. The water level held for a while before it began, slowly, by degrees, to go down. As the water receded, it uncovered the tops of mountains first. The highest points of the earth broke through the surface of the water and appeared again, but they appeared empty. Whatever had been on those peaks before the water reached them, whatever creatures, whatever NEPHILIM had climbed to the very top and held on as long as possible, was gone. The peaks were bare. The rock was exposed to air again, but nothing stood on it. The ark eventually came to rest on solid ground as the water dropped enough to allow it. The door opened eventually. The beings inside came out onto an earth that looked different, shaped by the movement of that much water, altered in its surface, with sediment and material deposited everywhere the water had moved. The earth was changed, and it was empty of everything that had been outside the ark. The NEPHILIM had been everywhere on this earth before the flood, in every region, across every kind of landscape, in large numbers. After the water receded and the ground dried, there were none. The land that had carried them, the mountains they had climbed, the valleys they had crossed, all of it was now under the control of whatever the flood left behind. And the flood left behind a world that started again from the point of the ark. Everything the NEPHILIM had built, whatever structures they had made, whatever they had marked on the land, whatever evidence of their presence had been physical and fixed, was rearranged or buried under the weight and movement of water that had covered the entire earth. The land did not hold the shape they had left on it. The water had moved everything. The beings that came out of the ark stepped onto ground that had no NEPHILIM on it, not hiding somewhere, not in a remote location, not in the deep water still living. They were gone, completely and entirely removed from the earth's surface by the flood. Everything that the flood was designed to remove was removed. The NEPHILIM were part of what was removed. There is nothing in the land after the flood that suggests any of them continued. The earth that opened up after the water went down was a different earth than the one they had known. The populations that would eventually grow from the ones who came out of the ark would spread across this world. They would find evidence in the ground, bones, remnants, signs of what had existed before. But they would find nothing living. The NEPHILIM left no continuation. The size they had, the power they had, the dominance they had held over the earth before the rain started, none of it was enough. Size does not negotiate with water. Strength does not prevent drowning. The 40 days were exactly what was required to ensure that there was no corner of the earth, no peak high enough, no capacity for survival that could keep them above the surface long enough to outlast the flood. They went under one by one across the surface of a world that had become entirely water. And when the water finally finished receding and the earth was dry ground again, the Nephilim chapter of this world's history was over, not diminished, not relocated, finished. The earth that emerged from the flood was an earth without them. And that was the point. What the closed door of the ark separated was permanent. Inside survived, outside did not. The Nephilim were outside, and the flood made sure that outside meant gone.